You know, the great problem we have in this curious civilization of ours is not that we have too little to do, but that we have been utterly mesmerized by the future. We are, as it were, caught in a form of intellectual plumbing, a complex system of time binding, where the present moment is perpetually choked up by all the possibilities of what might happen. We have developed a peculiar talent, quite magnificent in its own way, for describing the course of events, for laying out a map of tomorrow. But the price we pay for this marvelous ability is simply astronomical. We experience the emotions appropriate to future possibilities as if they were present happenings, and this, precisely, is what we call anxiety. The so-called civilized man, the man who lives primarily through his descriptive language, is therefore in a state of chronic worry and chronic fear. He is never confronted with the simple, refreshing actuality of what is happening right now, but rather with the innumerable, terrifying, and always uncontrollable possibilities of what might come next. And so, we suffer a kind of neurological sclerosis, a blocking of the channels of our own sensibility. We lose the capacity for joyous abandon because we are always holding ourselves tight, bracing for the crash that might or might not come. We get stuffy, and that stuffiness is what we have mistaken for seriousness or responsibility. Now, when we look back across the great cultures of the past, we see that there has always been a way out of this chronic tension in ancient India, when a person had played their role, when they had contributed to the great organized social view of the world, what we might call the mandala. They reached a point where they could say, "Look here, I've had quite enough of all this." They were simply tired of making life not worth living by, going through the horrors of the future in the name of efficiency and membership in the community. They abandoned the structured life, gave up caste, and entered the state of vanaprastha, the forest dweller. This man, the sannyasin, goes back, symbolically, to the style of life that predates the settled agrarian culture. He returns to the shaman state. He becomes, in a sense, the hunter of old, who had nobody around him to tell him how he ought to feel, or how he ought to interpret the movement of the wind or the shape of the cloud. He must make his own exploration, find out for himself, find out who he really is, because he is tired of being told how he ought to feel and how he ought to behave. But we must be careful here. This return to the forest is not a literal regression. It is not becoming a wolf man, running naked and eating food off the ground. It is no more a regression than when we speak of a wise person as one who has become again as a child. They haven't forgotten how to speak or think. They have simply stopped being childish in their attachments and their fears. The return to the forest, the vanaprastha, is the going beyond the conditioned social pattern, the communal view of the world. And this brings us directly to our question about anxiety. What do spiritual awake people do with their anxiety? They recognize that their anxiety is simply the emotional echo of that clever ability to describe and prefigure what might happen. Anxiety is the sound of the description running ahead of the actual experience. The truly awake person does not try to get rid of the anxiety, because that would simply be another form of control, another time-binding description saying, "I should be calm tomorrow." They realize that the anxiety, the fear, the tension is a necessary and integral part of the whole human system, just as the shadow is necessary for the light to exist. If you try to destroy the anxiety, you destroy the feeling of the present moment which the anxiety describes. What they do then is precisely nothing. They simply watch it. They allow the emotion to be exactly what it is. The feeling of anxiety is just as much a manifestation of the spontaneous, self-arising universe as the chirping of a bird or the flow of the blood. It is not my anxiety. It is simply anxietying in the same way the rain is raining. When one ceases to identify the self with the chronic worry, when one stops saying, "I am a worried person," and simply observes the phenomenon of worry as an impersonal flow of energy, then the tension surrounding the anxiety dissolves. The content remains perhaps, but the clutching goes. This is the great self-discovered secret of the forest dweller. You see, the authentic experience, the enlightenment, the moksha, cannot be transmitted. It cannot be codified. It is something one finds out for oneself. It is first-hand between oneself and one's universe. This discovery is authentic and genuine because it is not based on authority, not on what a priest or a swami or a psychiatrist tells you is healthy. Each one of us is thrown back on our own resources. We are back in the symbolic forest. We are like that hunter who must use his own senses, make his own exploration, and stop looking out of the corner of his eye to see if everyone else is getting the same result. And the fascinating thing is that when people truly find out for themselves, through their own direct encounter with the world, they discover a common measure of agreement. They discover that the root of all worry, all anxiety, is simply the mask, the role that they are playing in society, the attempt to be a person, the Latin word for which means exactly that, a mask. But when you stop trying to be that person, that role, and simply allow life to live you, you become, in the truest sense of the word, a self. You become an original, authoritative source of life. And at that point, anxiety is just another piece of the scenery, recognized as the perfectly necessary and ultimately marvelous movement of the whole thing. And so, we are all alone together, whistling in the dark, making our own way back to the forest, learning to trust the feeling of our own 2 feet on the unpredictable earth. And so we were just observing this fascinating movement, the individual leaving the structured world, the man retreating from the civilized society that has burdened him with chronic worry. This is not some quaint, ancient Indian custom we're talking about. This is a pattern. It is the necessary return to the forest, a going back to the fundamentals of existence. And what does this return accomplish in regard to anxiety? Well, the crucial thing we have to notice is how the civilized world creates its problem. It does so by what we can call the myth of the container. We are convinced that there is a self, a little I inside the skin, and this I is the controller. It has thoughts, it owns feelings, it does the breathing and does the worrying. This little I is desperately trying to solidify itself, to feel permanent and important within the great social circle of agreement, that communal view of the world that tells us what is real, what is right, and what we should all be striving for. When that social circle begins to break up, as it is doing so violently in our modern relativistic age, the little I feels violently insecure. The ground is shaking, and so the anxiety, which is simply the nervous system doing its job, reacting to instability, is immediately claimed by the ego. The ego says, "I am anxious, I have this fear," and by claiming it, the ego attempts to wrestle with it, to suppress it, to impose its own puny will upon the vast, spontaneous wisdom of the body. The so-called spiritual awake person sees this entire operation for the magnificent comedy that it is. They realize, as they retreat into the symbolic forest, that they are not doing the anxiety. Think about it. Do you will your thoughts into existence? No. They simply arise, don't they? They pop up, uninvited, like bubbles on a stream, and the anxiety is exactly the same spontaneous, unwilled event. It is the stream bubbling. It is the wind blowing. It is the sound of the organism adjusting to what it cannot control. When the awake person experiences anxiety, they stop the futile fight. They allow the feeling to be not as a sign of their personal failure, but as a sign of the universe operating through them. They have given up the illusion of being the driver. They become the passenger, watching the landscape go by, including the bumpy, frightening parts of the road. This is the great principle of effortless action, the recognition that the best way to handle a thing that is already happening spontaneously is to simply let it happen. When you stop trying to fix the feeling, the energy that was bound up in the internal conflict, the tension of the resistance, is released. And this released energy doesn't just disappear. It becomes available to you as unconditional life force. The anxiety that was once a prison becomes merely a wave passing through the ocean of the self. The wave is still there, but you realize that you are not the wave. You are the ocean, and the ocean is entirely secure in its vastness, regardless of how many little white caps of worry appear on its surface. This is the transition from being a person, a mask, a role struggling to maintain its performance in the social ring, to being a self, an original, authoritative source of life. The self is not worried about its status or its consistency, because it is the entire context. It is the forest itself. When we are forced, as we are today, out of our comfortable, guaranteed certainties and thrown upon our own resources, it is a magnificent opportunity. It is a terrifying blessing. We have no authority left to tell us how to be sane, how to be healthy, or how to be happy. We have to find it out ourselves. We must become our own shamans, our own solitary explorers. And the universal discovery of these solitary explorers, the thing they all agree upon, is that the moment you stop struggling with the way things are, the moment you fully admit the anxiety, the fear, the confusion as a temporary and natural feature of the landscape, that very moment, the world ceases to be a problem to be solved and becomes instead a mystery to be lived. It is in this profound acceptance that the anxiety loses its sharp, debilitating edge, transforming into a mere energetic hum, a sound like any other that can be listened to without compulsion, a sound that we can whistle along to as we continue our walk through the forest. That's right. The crucial point is that this acceptance of the world as a mystery rather than a problem, leads us directly to the great final paradox that the spiritual awake person apprehends. It is the realization that the I, which struggles with the anxiety, is fundamentally the same I which is being struggled with, the identity of the problem and the solver. When we talk about the little I, the ego, the mask, the separate individual, trying to solve the problem of its own anxiety, we are watching a magnificent, futile game. The mind is attempting to pull itself up by its own bootstraps. It is the belief that the hand can actually grasp itself. But what happens when the awakened individual finally understands this fundamental identity? They realize that the supposed gap between the feeler and the feeling is an illusion created by language. We have been taught to describe reality as a world of subjects acting upon objects. I am anxious. I have a fear. I feel a pain. However, in the experience of the spontaneous self, the one who has truly returned to the forest and is living without the communal rulebook, there is simply the anxietying, there is the fearing, there is the aching. It is a continuous, self-organizing event, just like the weather. The true liberation comes when the feigned distinction between the self and the experience breaks down. The anxious individual is not a person having anxiety. They are the entire field of the anxietying experience, and when this happens, who is left to fight the anxiety? Who is left to solve the problem? The illusion of the controller vanishes, and when the controller vanishes, the chronic tension of being perpetually controlled vanishes with it. This entire breakthrough hinges on a profound shift in how the awakened person views the cosmos. For the worried, civilized person, the universe is a war. It is a serious, grim moral struggle where one must constantly battle against evil, against chaos, against the inevitable forces of decay, and, yes, against their own unacceptable feelings. But the moment you stop fighting the anxiety, the moment you see the anxietying as something that simply happens as you realize that the universe is not a war, but a dance. Alan Watts always insisted that the universe, or the Tao, is essentially a play. It is utterly serious when it needs to be, just as a musician is utterly serious when playing a difficult passage. But the point of the music is not to get to the end, but to play. The point of the dance is not to get to a certain spot on the floor, but to dance. Anxiety, then, is simply a fascinating movement within the dance. It is the spontaneous contraction that balances the spontaneous expansion. It is the rhythm of the life pulse. The awake person is liberated not by escaping the anxiety, but by accepting it as the necessary negative space of their own joy and awareness. You cannot have the ecstatic expansion without the nervous contraction. And if life is fundamentally a play, then the greatest sin is not immorality or failure. The greatest sin is stuffiness, taking the whole performance so terribly, terribly seriously. The awake person is free to be utterly anxious when anxiety arises, and utterly joyous when joy arises, because they realize that neither state is a permanent, essential definition of who they are. They are the space in which the whole marvelous, messy, contradictory show unfolds. They are the forest in which the hunter lives, the awareness that allows for the anxietying, but is never trapped by it, this surrender to the spontaneous flow, this playful acceptance of the inevitable worry that comes from being conscious, is the profound, paradoxical thing that so-called spiritual awake people do with their anxiety. They simply allow the performance to continue. And the beauty of this perspective is that it requires no guru, no dogma, and no further striving. It is a discovery that is perpetually available simply by breathing in and observing the current feeling as something the universe is doing right now. And so, the ultimate freedom found by the one who has returned to the forest is not freedom from anxiety, but freedom to be anxious, to be sad, to be ecstatic, to be the entire unfolding drama without feeling obligated to correct it. When you stop treating life as a problem you have to solve and recognize it as a music you simply allow to play, the anxiety itself becomes part of the rhythm. It is the necessary low note that allows the high note to exist. This is the great effortless action, not fighting the flow, but becoming the flow, and in this final, playful realization, the worry which once felt like the entire world pressing down on you dissolves into what it always was. Just the sound of your own intelligence, singing a little tune of possibility.